Now, sunsets are a subject that I tend to shy away from. And the reason why is I think that they can look a little bit hokey. And also, I've seen a bunch of sunsets that if you were to paint that, there's no way anybody would believe you that the sky looked like that. And they also form a pretty huge technical challenge as well. But anyway, in this video, I found a nice low-key sunset with a couple of boats just chilling on the water. Thought it made a pretty good painting. Let's talk about how I created this painting, and I want to share some techniques with you along the way. So without further ado, let's sling some paint. Now, as I mentioned, I'm going to be painting this scene of a couple of sailboats on the water with a beautiful landscape just kind of fading into the background and those really nice subdued sunset colors. There's a few technical things here going on with this project that I want to discuss with you through this video. And also, I'm going to share with you the materials that I used to create this piece. And as always, you're going to find the materials listed in that description down below. Without further ado, let's get stuck into it. I start off with a 16 by 20 inch Belgian linen stretcher. I make these myself. It's simply a hard board reinforced with some wooden edging around the back, and then a triple primed, acrylic primed Belgian linen goes over the top of that. And I give this a coat of a color. Normally it's burnt sienna, but here I was trying some sort of weird combination of a bit of cadmium and quinacridone to give that nice pink flush. Thought it'd be perfect for this sunset scene. So after I first sketch up my composition, I then begin to mix up some colors on my palette, going right the way through the spectrum, the colors that I think would work best for this sky. Now, the trick with sunsets is to make a combination of colors and an even gradient going from that topmost color in the composition down to those warmer tones without having it go green. And this is where a bit of knowledge of complementary opposites will help. So here I'm using ultramarine blue and quinacridone magenta, and that forms a bit of a violet. So when I introduce the yellow to that, well, those two are complementary opposites, so they have the tendency to go gray. Similarly, if the colors got a little bit too blue, then I'd introduce a bit more red so that that would go orange. The blue and the orange are also complementary opposites, and when they are introduced to one another, they too will have the tendency to go gray. So there really isn't much in the way of intense saturated color here. It's very low key, and I kind of like it because I want to just have a nice even transition and focus on the boats and the water, but just have that nice warm glow of that end of day light. It's a very simple painting indeed. Now, that sky, I'm just going to leave as an even gradient and then just start working on these layers of the landscape. They almost look like cut out colored paper in my photographic reference. It's quite strange. There's not much in the way of features, but there's a gradual stepping down in tone and a stepping up in chroma. So the colors become richer, a bit more intense as they come forward. So here I'm dropping the tone with some burnt umber and that ultramarine blue. And I've got plenty of that red and magenta coming through until we get to the trees here of this little island. And that's a very dark tone indeed, but I can still go so much further. That's mainly ultramarine blue and burnt umber there. So I start to cut a line of the horizon, the way that water meets that distant hillside. What's important here is the edges where one zone meets another. I feather ever so slightly across that edge so I don't have a harsh, sharp line. I also don't want ridge lines, and those are artifacts left by the physical accumulation of paint either side of a brush stroke. So I make sure that those ridge lines are nice and smooth. I tamp them back down if I see anything that's a little bit too thick. Now here, planning is essential. Notice how I've got a series of strokes kind of leaning down towards the bottom right-hand corner and then leaning back towards the left-hand corner, creating almost a checkerboard effect. It's quite strange at first, and Often it can be a bit daunting when you first start out with this technique, but you've just got to stick with it and keep adding one brush stroke after another, and eventually it comes right, trust me. And then when you begin to add lighter notes of color, some lighter blue and some more of those gold notes from the light in the sunset, it can begin to form quite an interesting surface. Now the boats here are very dark indeed, and I really wanted to go for a loose approach to this painting and not fiddle with it too much, although it did get a little bit fiddly in a couple of places. But you notice here this tonal stepping down effect once again. So here some of the accents on this boat are nearly pure black, as dark as I could muster. So it's a combination of burnt umber and straight ultramarine blue at about a ratio of 50-50. Now to get some of these details in here, if we can call them details, these eclipse long filberts are perfect. All the brushes that I use are made by Rosemary & Co, and you'll find a link to those in the description down below. So once I've painted the boat above the water, I then start to work with what is reflecting in the water, and that's where the edge of that eclipse long filbert is really handy in forming some of those finer lines. Most of this painting was done in one sitting, so the surface is still wet as I'm working into it, which can be nice for some softer cloud effects and working with that wet and wet technique. Here I apply some clouds to the sky above, and it's a nice opportunity to get some of that light from the sinking sun just reflecting on the underside of some of those clouds. Now in hindsight, I probably should have taken the edges or the zones a little bit closer together, just painted right the way across, and tried to apply the masts and the rigging just straight over the top of the wet paint, because I have to go back and address some of those ghosts showing through. That's that initial pink underpainting, or the imprimatura. It's a little bit tricky just closing up the gap there, although I do like a bit of a flush of warmth coming through. It does add a nice little bit of heat, very reminiscent of the sunset atmosphere I'm trying to convey. But there is that lead mast there on that sailing ship that I think could be addressed, if I'm honest. Now I add a few of these details here to this Norfolk Island pine, way out on this island, and it's just flicked in there with the edge of a tissue dagger bristle. Once I'm happy with where everything is, I then begin to add some more impasto texture and get some real thickness into that water. This is best applied with that blade edge of the dagger brush. I mix in a bit of impasto medium to my colors and begin to draw this across. Now, one thing about thick paint, particularly thick lighter paint, so light in terms of tone, much higher on the value scale, is it will reflect light back to the viewer and really give it an illusion that there's a light coming from this painting. You know, we've got to plan our tonal dynamic from the outset. We've got to plan where our darkest darks are going to go and the lightest lights. But when you couple this with the use of the material of the paint, it can be very powerful. And so here, it's only a little bit, but you can see some of that thickness towards those strokes that are just at the back end of that sailing ship. And that's the area of greatest contrast as well, and where I hope the viewer might spend a little bit of time just enjoying that little bit of water. Now I drop the tone, so I'm not quite as bright as I bring some of these lighter ripples down into the bottom of the composition. I begin to work back and forth with some of the foreground ripples. Now, just in terms of perspective, notice here how the angle is so much more extreme down towards the bottom of the composition, but these lines begin to flatten out, approach horizontal closer to that horizon line. This just helps create a sense of depth within the scene. Now, I can do a pretty good job getting some fine little ripply marks with the dagger brush, but this eclipse filbert is probably best suited for this technique. So I continually load my brush. I make sure that I'm not trying to do too much with one brush load. I keep going back to that palette, picking up more of that dark paint because the surface is incredibly wet and I'm picking up some of that underlying color. So as I reload my brush, I'm able to get some nice marks over the top. and get that crisp blackness for the water in the foreground, but also some of these other boat details like the rigging. And here we've got a mast, and I'm drawing this in with an ivory round. This is a number 0. And looking back, I probably shouldn't have messed with the rigging. I think it might have weakened the painting overall. It still is a fun project and ended up looking pretty cool. But looking back, I think that maybe less is more and more is less, more or less. In addition to my synthetic pointed round, I'm also using an ivory rigger. This can be quite handy for some of those straight lines. Now there's a bit of reflected light on top of those boats, and I adjust the tones in the water and add my tonal best. You know, I like to save that for the very end. And this is that bright white burnout from that sun just sinking past the hillside. Now, when we plan our painting in terms of tone, then those little bright moments will stand proud and give the illusion of light coming out of the surface. In this painting, I wanted to go for a nice subdued sunset without too much gaudy color. I'm pretty happy with the way this came out. And now that I finished this project, I might give it another shot. Well, I really hope you've enjoyed this video and you've come away with a technique or two and something to apply to your next project. If you're new here, then please do me a huge favor. Click that like button, leave me a comment down below, make sure you're subscribed to this channel, and click that bell notification icon so you're notified when I upload another video. As always, if you have any questions about the materials that I use in my demonstrations, you'll always find those listed down below. Thank you so much for stopping by. I've really enjoyed your company, and I'll see you again in the next video.